keep working the slides for me? Okay. Just want to remind everyone to sign in if you would, because we'd like to document the public interest in this site. And there's also a checklist there if you want to be added to our distribution list. I send out periodic emails on what's going on. I'll mention that briefly. So I'm going to start just reviewing the agenda. We've got 2 slides. I'll just review this briefly. The purpose of the meeting, information and locations and staff contacts, DEQ authority and oversight, a brief environmental history, a brief legal history, summary of the current requirements, the provisions for modifications that are available, the reasons for the proposed changes, the criteria we use for evaluating the proposal, an overview of the proposal, the DEQ's preliminary review, a review of the next steps, and then public questions and comments. So we'll start with the purpose of the meeting, basically to summarize PLS-Pall Life Sciences proposal to modify the cleanup criteria and the relevance to the existing legal documents, which include the consent judgment, which was entered in 1992, and there have been at least 2 court orders that are related to this proposal, entered in 2004 and 5. We also want to inform you about the DEQ's decision-making process, and obviously to accept public comment. The information bulletin that we've got on the table as you came in has the information on how you can provide written comment, and we also will put that information up at the end of our presentation. Okay, I guess I'm ready for the next slide. Information, locations, and staff contacts. I already put up our names and email addresses and phone numbers. Again, that information is also on the information bulletin. We also have a website which has been, we've posted most of the documents, significant documents online for the past 3 or 4 years. And there's also information repositories. The downtown library is the only one now where I think current documents are being printed out by them, because just this year, in order to save resources, we began providing documents completely electronically, so those are available on our website. But periodically, I send out, when I send out emails to my distribution list, I inform you of the documents. I send out a list of the documents available, and typically those documents are linked, so you can click right on it and get directly to any documents you're interested in looking at. But the city, the county, SIO, and Ann Arbor Townships all have documents available to review as well. Again, if you want updates, give us your email address and I will add you to our distribution list. I send out updates, it depends, once a month, twice a month. It's not a daily thing by any stretch of the imagination. The information bulletin is very basic, and we're going to kind of, we're not going into a lot of detail. We want to give you a little bit of background. I guess one thing we wanted to ask is how many of you here tonight are new and just learning about the Gelman site. We've got 1 hand, 2 hands. So,
a general thing or a certain aspect.
Right. Well, as I said, I'm going to cover relatively quickly just a general history of things, and we're going to give you a summary of the proposal and describe to you how we're reviewing the proposal. And then we'll open it up for public comment.
The thing we're trying to ascertain is, with a site with so much history, over 20 years of history, we're trying to ascertain what terminology to use. Are people familiar with the various plumes and the fact that there are numerous plumes of contamination, or do we need to go to a more basic level? So that's what we're trying to assess, because we want to be flexible and not bore people with too many details if it's all review, but if we need to get into some more basics and describe things as we're going along, we can do that too.
So we've got this room until 10 o'clock tonight. We're expecting our presentation to take close to an hour, so that would allow up to 2 hours for questions and comments. If as we're making our presentation, there are pressing questions that you just don't understand or going too fast, we'd be glad to take your questions during the presentation. But if it's not important enough and you can wait until the end, we think we can get through our presentation faster and get to your questions and comments. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mitch briefly.
Okay, once again, can you hear me if I in the back, if I talk without the mic? Thank you.
Roger might want you to.
Use the mic.
Roger's making me use the mic. Okay. A couple things. As I said, we want to run this meeting very flexibly and tailor it to the needs and the level of knowledge of the audience. So I think what Sybil's last point about asking questions during the presentation, if some of the people that aren't as familiar with the history, I think we'll use a lot of terms like evergreen plume, and if you've got any uncertainty, raise your hand and flag it and we'll back up, okay? I'm asking that people turn off their cell phones or turn them to vibrate or silent mode so it doesn't interrupt the meeting, please. I also, we aren't going to do this as a formal public meeting and then a public hearing. We're going to have questions and answers throughout the night. We've got a microphone up front when we get to the actual public comment phase so that we can record the comments, and Sybil and I are going to be busy listening and going between questions and answers. So we want to make sure we capture the comments that get made tonight. I wanted to acknowledge some of the elected officials that are in the audience tonight and ask you to raise your hands. I see Senator Brader, Ryan Seabolt with Representative Burns' office, Steve Rapundolo with the City Council, Mike Moran with Ann Arbor Township, and Adele Laporte with Barton Village. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you everyone for being here. Okay, briefly I'm going to talk about the DEQ's involvement in the site. DEQ was formed in 1995. It succeeded part of the Department of Natural Resources in 1995. We've been involved with the site for over 20 years, and the main environmental statute that we're involved with is called Part 201 of the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act, or the NEREPA. It's also known as the Environmental Remediation part of the Environmental Code, which is the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act. And some people may be familiar with Act 307, which is the predecessor to Part 201, also formerly known as the Polluter Pay Law. It was amended in 1995. Two important amendments. It changed the liability scheme, didn't really affect the liability at this site. More importantly, for I think the purposes of tonight's meeting, it revised the cleanup risk level and the allowed for land use-based cleanups, so that there can be cleanup categories such as residential, industrial, commercial, and then limited categories for those same things, as well as a site-specific category. The DEQ is the agency that administers Part 201, and there's a consent judgment with Pall Life Sciences, the successor to Gelman, and we oversee compliance with that consent judgment. And I'm going to turn it back over to you. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sybil.
Okay, and your pointer is... All right, we're just going to kind of acquaint you with the area, which you may be well acquainted with, but this is Wagner Road. This is the Pall Life Sciences facility. We have designated here 3 separate plumes. The red one is called the core area. That's where it's the shallowest and most contaminated. This is the Evergreen plume, which is an intermediate depth plume and flows northeast to the Evergreen subdivision area. And this is the Unit E plume, which overlaps in places with these other 2 plumes. And we have Maple Road. Where is the, can't see there. That's Maple Road. That's a key area we'll be discussing. We've got the Maple Village Shopping Center, and this thing isn't showing up very well. And there we go. And that's Veterans Park right there. So that's just to orient you a little bit. We'll have some figures interspersed here as we go along, but I just wanted to kind of acquaint you with the location of the plumes. So the next, we'll talk about the brief technical history of the site. Mitch, you could switch the slide, please. And most of you may be familiar with this. Gelman Sciences used dioxane or 1,4-dioxane from 1966 until 1986 in their processes to make medical filters. There were discharges to groundwater. Some of those were permitted, some were not permitted. Dioxane being completely soluble in water, it leaches easily from the soil, and because of the complex geology in the area, as I showed you on the previous slide, the dioxane moved through the soil and into the groundwater and spread in the various directions that you saw there. Contaminated wells were first discovered in the fall of 1985. PLS-Pall Life Sciences, which is the successor to Gelman Sciences, in about 1997, somewhere in that area. They are the responsible party and took over the cleanup. So I should say Gelman began the investigation. But in any case, the groundwater standard at that time was 3 parts per billion, and that was basically at that time the default drinking water standard based on human exposure assumptions. So that's just a very brief early history. And in terms of the legal history, the DNR was involved in this site basically from the beginning, and because they were not satisfied with the progress that was being made on the site, filed a lawsuit against Gelman Sciences in 1988. That was resolved in October of 1992 by 2 consent judgments. One of those was for response actions. The other was for past costs that the state had used to hook up people, mainly in the Evergreen subdivision, I believe. And so that money was repaid to the state, and then the DEQ, DNR then, now the DEQ, oversees compliance with the consent judgment. In 2000, again, we had several issues with the progress at the site, and the DEQ, through the Attorney General's office, filed a motion in court to enforce the consent judgment. And there was an evidentiary hearing, which ultimately resulted in a 5-year plan. The court actually mandated at that time that the site be cleaned up by July in 2005. That was based on PLS testimony in court. Shortly after the 5-year plan was approved by the court, and actually due to some of the drilling that the court ordered as a result of that action, the Unit E contamination, the Unit E plume, the deeper plume, was discovered, and prior to that time it was believed that the deep aquifer was protected by a thick clay layer. Unfortunately, that was not the case. So then we got involved in another lengthy process. The company did a feasibility study and looked at many different alternatives for addressing the problem. Ultimately, the court entered an order that put in place a prohibition zone and required, and I'll explain the prohibition zone in just a minute, also required certain interim responses at Maple Road and at Wagner Road, and I will talk about those in a little more detail later. But the prohibition zone, which we showed on the I don't know if I have a slide. If I inserted a slide in the next, no, I didn't. Sorry, it's the next slide. But in any case, the the prohibition zone restricts the use of groundwater, and so you can see this dark line here is what was established in May of 2005, and pretty much the reason it could be established was because almost everybody within that area was on city water, and so it's just a legal requirement that's allowed by our statute. Right. Well, the company, as part of this, the court order that was issued required the company to do a well identification survey, and there were a few wells known about it that the company had to pay to connect those homes to city water. None of those wells were actually impacted with dioxane, but the legal prohibition against using the groundwater required Paul to hook them up to city water. Yes, anyone within the prohibition zone now, if there is anyone else out there, we're not aware of anyone else at this point. The company has a continuing requirement, obligation to provide a water supply to anyone who's using a residential or a water supply well. Okay, so anyway, this is. I'll try to stick to the legal issues. There were subsequent disputes. Many of those were related to the Evergreen system. Some we were able to resolve voluntarily. Others we had to go to the court to get those resolved. And then how the current process evolved, basically, we meet regularly with a core group of citizens that are involved in the site. The Coalition for Action on Remediation of Dioxane, the CARD group. The company, and as we'll discuss a little bit later, had basically, it was public information that they were considering some kind of changes, and the Ann Arbor News had an article in the paper back in November. Some of you may have seen that. Coincidentally or not, a month later, Judge Shelton of the Washtenaw County Circuit Court called the DEQ and the Pall Life Sciences attorneys with the Attorney General's office representing the DEQ into his chambers, and basically his whole purpose was, well, okay, if you really want and need to make changes, let's get something scheduled, let's get a process going so we can make this happen and not have this endless back and forth. So basically he required the parties to come up with an order, including a schedule of how this process would go forward. And he also indicated that if there were any disagreements about what that schedule would be, that we would put those disagreements in the order. So that draft order was submitted to him on January 16th, and I think, is there another slide? Yeah, okay. So we met the judge's schedule, but then we sat and waited for a couple of months for him to actually issue an order, and he didn't call anyone back to ask questions. He just issued the order basically using Pall Life Sciences schedule, which called for Paul to submit their proposal by April 24th and the DEQ to respond by May 22nd, which is 4 weeks. And we took some steps through our Attorney General. We were able to file a stipulation along with Pall Life Sciences attorneys to extend the schedule basically by 2 weeks, but also delaying the submittal of the proposal to May 4th. And so although the order that was issued and the stipulation that revised the order did not specifically mention the public comment period, the Attorney General informed the court and Pall Life Sciences that it was our intention to have a public comment period, and so we basically squeezed a 4-week public comment period into a 6-week review time frame. And just for your information, typically when we get a remedial action plan or a modification to a remedial action plan, which this essentially is, we have up to 6 months to review it. And we typically do have a 30-day review period. That's fairly common, but so I'm just pointing that out to let you know that we're really being pressed to act on this. And as soon as we knew what the schedule was, we informed our local contacts that we would be getting the proposal on May 4th, which we did at the end of the day on May 4th, and within a day, or not more than 2 days, we had that proposal online and available for the public to review, along with the schedule that has been set forth to that we are now in the process of trying to comply with. So I think the next part is related to the summary of the current requirements, because I think it's important for everyone to understand what's currently required in order to be able to comment on what the proposed changes are. So, and I've got another slide in here in a minute that will, I mean, you may want to let them read the other one just for a minute, I suppose. Basically, the consent judgment divided the site into systems, and there were 4 groundwater systems: the core and the western, the evergreen, and the marshy. And I guess you could go to the slide now. So as I pointed out, the red is the core, and then the marshy, it doesn't have a designation, but it's very small. It's very close to the end of that point right there. And then the evergreen system. The Unit E was not known at that time. And the western system is way out here, and the western system is quite small at this point and fairly low concentrations, but it is still part of the facility. There was also the soil system, which there are some high concentrations in a relatively small area that are quite deep in the ground. That hasn't been sampled since about 1998, I believe. And there was also the spray irrigation system, which now meets criteria. So we're not really discussing that today. And then currently the company is extracting and treating about 1,100 gallons per minute. They have numerous extraction wells. We don't have those plotted on this map, but there are quite a few monitoring wells in these plume areas. They are discharged. They're treating it at a treatment system on their property, and it's being discharged under an NPDES permit, which is the DEQ, also the Water Bureau of the DEQ oversees, and that's being discharged to the Honey Creek tributary at about 1,100 gallons per minute. And again, we have Wagner Road here, Maple Road here, and Pall Life Sciences right in this area. Okay, so then, as I mentioned before, the Unit E contamination was discovered, and that was put into place with the prohibition zone and interim responses. The interim responses are being done through an extraction well on Wagner Road, and the intent of that well is to prevent contamination above 85 parts per billion, which is our, I may not have mentioned, that's our current generic groundwater cleanup criterion. There were changes to that number. As I told you earlier, it was 3 parts per billion originally. Due to legislation and also due to the formulas that the toxicologists use, that number is now 85 parts per billion. So they're supposed to prevent migration above 85 parts per billion from migrating east of Wagner Road to the extent practical, and that was the judge's language basically, because he believed it was more important to make sure that they had the capacity to take care of the other wells that are pumping and removing some of the other source areas. And And then in addition, they have to prevent migration above 2,800 parts per billion in the Unit E aquifer from migrating east of Maple Road. And I think there's another, the next slide will show that same figure again. Keep pushing the wrong button. Okay, so again, the 2,800 parts per billion number, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, is the criteria for the groundwater surface water interface. And basically what that means is, according to the toxicologists, that's the number, because groundwater typically in Michigan often flows and then vents or discharges to the surface water. So it comes closer to the surface and it discharges into the surface water. And so 2,800 parts per billion is the amount of dioxane that is considered to be safe for the organisms that live in the surface waters. And the reason, now obviously Maple Road is not a surface water, but the presumption was that the plume is going to move to the east and eventually vent or discharge to the Huron River. So by applying the standard at Maple Road, it was felt that that was being more conservative. And as long as the water is deep underground, which it generally is, and nobody is drinking the water, there's no risk. And that's basically how our statute works since the 1995 amendments that Mitch mentioned earlier. And then they're also, of course, required to monitor the migration of the plume. The Pall Life Sciences did some additional investigation down gradient, and they're also monitoring the migration of the plume to make sure that it's not going outside of the prohibition zone boundaries, or to detect it before it gets there, because obviously the area within the prohibition zone is protected, but if concentrations above 85 parts per billion got outside of the prohibition zone, then that would be a threat that potentially somebody could be using that water. And I also wanted to mention, before you change the next slide, when this prohibition zone was drawn in 2005, and it does continue across there. It's not, that black heavy line does not show above the plume. It was really very difficult for us. I mean, we didn't realize at the time this line was drawn, we didn't have the same definition of this Unit E plume that we have now. I know, I'm having a hard time seeing it myself. Okay, but the Unit E plume was not as, oh, he's going to change the battery. We did not realize at the time that there are actually connections between the Evergreen plume, the eastern end of the Evergreen plume, and the adjacent area of the Unit E plume. So, like I said, we had to draw that line so closely because Pall Life Sciences currently is required to clean up the Evergreen plume to 85 parts per billion to meet our criterion. And yet the Unit E plume can be up to 2,800 parts per billion within the zone, but nothing above 85 can migrate outside of it without action at least being needed to be taken. So, and then we discovered that there in fact are connections between these two plumes, and I think Mitch is going to address that a little bit more. Is that any better? Yeah, we should have done this earlier. Okay, so anyway, I think you can kind of see, and so, and we know in this area, for instance, that there's not a clay layer between the Unit E and the Evergreen plume in that area. So it's really quite complicated and very hard to explain in a short period of time. We're trying to give you a rough idea, and we'll certainly answer questions as we go along, because certainly it's important to understand. Go ahead. Okay, sure. That's a good question. Originally, the core area, the highest concentrations were about 200,000 parts per billion. The Evergreen plume and the, I mean, they're much lower now. They're roughly, I'd have to look at my data, 10,000. I'm not sure if there's anything above 10,000 right now. Roger would probably know that off the top of his head. This part of the Evergreen plume here had in the past been 3,000 parts per billion or a little bit more. It's now a few wells that are a little over 1,000 parts per billion. The Unit E plume has in this area an area that's above 3,000 parts per billion. We're not absolutely certain we've got it well enough defined. There could be some higher levels. When they did a vertical profiling, when they were drilling a well in this area a few years ago, I believe there was a result of 5,000 parts per billion, but that we didn't see that level in the actual monitoring well, as I recall. But again, they have been doing a lot of purging. The concentrations have gone down significantly. But so I don't know. Does that give you enough of a handle on it? They have quite a few monitoring wells, but we tend to always ask for more monitoring wells. It's just you put in one, and it seems to raise questions about other areas. So I think I've covered everything I'm supposed to in that section, and I think Mitch is going to cover the rest of it. Or not the rest of it, but the next section.
I'm going to switch slides in a minute, but a lot of things went into, I think, Paul's decision to submit a proposed revision to the cleanup plan, and those reasons include that our current understanding, our collective current understanding, I gotta change this, of the hydrogeology and the plume locations has changed a lot since the 1992 consent judgment was entered with the court. In addition to the 1995 amendments, the 2004 decision that the court made relative to the Unit E plume incorporated some of the 1995 changes, more specifically the allowance in law for what's called an institutional control, which we now at this site call the prohibition zone. And additional work that was required of Paul as a result of the Unit E decision recalled that at Wagner Road there's a requirement for them to pump and contain the 85 part per billion concentration. As a part of them doing additional work, they discovered some connection between the shallower so-called Evergreen plume and the Unit E plume, and that resulted in some disputes between us and Paul, as well as some concerns that we had about the requirement for them to contain over at Evergreen, and assertions that Paul made about they had a hypothesis that Unit E contamination was being sucked into the Evergreen area over in Maple, the Maple Village area. Yeah, thanks, Sybil. We're talking about, this is Maple Road right here. So one of the things Paul asserted was that some reasons we were seeing some anomalous concentrations was because there was, from the purging that was being done over here, it was being sucked in. We asked Paul to prove that. They installed some additional wells and didn't prove their hypothesis. So a number of things converged, and I'm going to switch over here. No, that's fine. And I'm going to cover the provisions in the law and the consent judgment for possibly revising the remediation plan. And then, in addition, we'll go over criteria and law and rules that apply. Then Sybil's going to talk about the proposal and an overview. I'll come back and explain the district's analysis, initial analysis of the proposal against the criteria and law and rules, and give you our initial recommendation that we're going to bring to Lansing, and we'll talk more about the process. Okay, with that, there's a provision in the existing consent judgment that basically says the parties may agree to modify the proposal upon mutual agreement. Some of it needs to be blessed by the court. Next, please. In addition, there's a provision in Part 201, the statute, that was amended in 1995. It's Section 2A that provides two important things relative to this discussion. The first part being legally enforceable agreements that were in effect at the time of the amendments, or more specifically, that were in effect in May 1 of 1995, even though the Act took effect in June. We're going to rule. But notwithstanding that, subsection 3 of 2A of Part 201 specifies that upon request of a person implementing response activities, the Department shall approve changes in a plan for response activity to be consistent with Sections 118 and 20A of the law. And next I'll go into what those sections provide for. Additional criteria relative to the decision-making here center around Part 201, the environmental remediation part of the environmental code, and the associated rules. Next, please. Okay, in Section 18, the overall, this is the section that applies to selections of remedial action plans or response activities by the department. And as Sybil mentioned earlier, because there's some complications here because of the fact we've got this legally enforceable agreement, i.e. the consent judgment, provisions that I just outlined in Section 2A about the department shall approve requests for modification, we use Section 18 and 20A as our yardstick. So it's important that we look at 20A, and there might be some parts of what's required in 18 or 20A that don't apply as a result of the fact that we've got this consent judgment, but we still use the provisions of Sections 18 and 20A to measure the proposal that they've submitted. And the overall, one of the important parts in Section 18 is that we have to assure that any remedy is protective of public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. And except as otherwise provided, the remedy or response activity has to comply with what's called applicable or relevant and appropriate requirements. Shorthand is ARARs, and what it really means is any applicable state or federal laws that would apply, applicable or relevant and appropriate. Next, please. You'll note that in the previous section there was an except as otherwise provided, and what that means for our purposes is there's a provision in the law that two specific rules under certain circumstances might be able to be waived. Rule 7055 is the rule that provides, it's a requirement for remedies that once a remedial action starts, the size of a plume cannot expand, and Rule 7056 provides that there has to be active remediation of groundwater contamination unless there's a documented naturally occurring chemical or biologic process. And so under certain circumstances, Section 18 allows us to waive those two rules. Next, please. Okay, additional criteria specified in Sections 18 and the associated rules are that remedies that permanently reduce the mobility, toxicity, and volume of the hazardous substances are to be preferred. It's not a requirement that they have to be selected, it's a preference. We have to gauge a proposed remedy in terms of its effectiveness in protecting public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. We look at the long-term uncertainties associated with a proposal. We're required to look at the persistence, toxicity, mobility, and propensity to bioaccumulate of the hazardous substance. We also are required to look at the short-term and long-term potential for adverse health effects from human exposure. And cost is a factor specified both in statute and rules, but it's only a factor among equally protective alternatives. Next, please. Additional criteria include reliability of the proposed remedy, the potential for future remedial costs if a remedy fails, the potential threat to human health, safety, welfare, and the environment associated with excavation, transportation, disposal, and containment, the ability to monitor remedial performance, and last but certainly not least, the public perspective about the extent to which the proposed remedial action effectively addresses the Part 201 requirements. And again, those requirements are in statute and rule. And that's obviously a big part of why we're here. And I want to publicly acknowledge Sybil right here at this point because, as she mentioned, the tight time frame we're under as a result of the court's involvement, I think it's a tribute to the work Sybil's been doing on the site all along that we were able to get the schedule changed to incorporate a public comment period. The DEQ does really think it's important for public participation. If we recognize one thing after our 20-plus years of involvement in this site is that we've got a very interested, educated community here, and we wanted to be sure and inform you about the decision-making that needs to go into this and solicit your feedback on that. And with that, I believe Sybil's going to outline the proposal.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, overview of the proposal. Okay, they've basically divided the site into two different areas as opposed to the 6 or 7 that we are currently dealing with. West of Wagner Road, they're calling the western area. They're proposing, before I get started on that, I wanted to make a few comments about some of the statements in the proposal itself. Actually, the very first paragraph, the last line, says, while this proposal has not been approved by the MDEQ, it reflects the comments and perspectives of both parties. Well, while we did give them a certain amount of feedback, we haven't approved or agreed to any of the representations within the proposal, and it's still under review. And we actually put that caveat above the link to the proposal on our website to make sure people understood that we have not blessed this proposal at this point. And there's just 2 examples I'll give you that were the most striking. The statement that the remediation carried out under the consent judgment and the court's recent remediation orders have been very successful. I don't think we would be here tonight if they had been very successful, so we really don't agree with that. And then the second statement is, as recently confirmed, the Evergreen plume would migrate east and merge with the Unit E plume if it was allowed to do so. In other words, if they stop capturing it, it will just go east into the prohibition zone and nobody has to worry about it. In fact, they did a water level study at our request. We evaluated that. We did not come to the same conclusion. Now, we didn't decide that the plume was going to the northeast, but we asked for additional investigation. We asked for 2 additional sets of monitoring wells. They installed one on Center near Bernice within the past few weeks. We expect to be getting the data from that boring and monitoring well cluster within the next week. They did not agree to put in the second monitoring well cluster that we asked for near Sequoia and Maple Road. So, we're going to evaluate what they submit, and we'll take that into account as part of our review. But we did not agree that their proposal confirmed that the plume would migrate to the east. So we just wanted to clarify that. So again, the western area, they have proposed on the west side of Wagner Road to operate selected extraction wells for mass removal, a total of about 600 gallons per minute. And that includes a new extraction well near Wagner, which is near MW94S. That's one of the higher concentration wells. That is an Evergreen plume or D2 aquifer monitoring well. that has been at about 2,500 and has not really gone down significantly. And Mitch, maybe you can, I think the next, well, if you go to the next slide, yeah. Okay. Of course, I don't have the monitoring wells on here, but it's in this area somewhere. So the higher levels of contamination that are still migrating to the Evergreen, they're going to cut off at this location or cut off some of it. We've been asking for that an extraction well at that location for a couple of years now. And so we do believe that is a good part of the proposal. Okay, and then the other related to the western area, the wells, they're going to purge, like I said, 5 or 6 different extraction wells within this area to a level of 500 parts per billion or possibly lower, to the point where they think they can determine that none of this outer area will expand above 85 parts per billion. So, and then at that point, they would propose to put deed restrictions on all the properties that are still affected. So as opposed to the prohibition zone, which is something that's typically done by ordinances with our statute, it was, I think, the first in the state that the court ordered the prohibition zone or the groundwater use restriction. But typically, if you're dealing with a relatively small number of parcels, which, you know, there's probably at least 20 parcels here, so if you can get a deed restriction on a property to prevent the use of groundwater, we prefer that because that becomes a part of the title to the property, and any future owner is going to do a title search and they're going to find out that, oh, I can't use this groundwater. Well, this area obviously has already been hooked up to municipal water, you know, shortly after the plumes were discovered. But they're proposing, you know, which they're basically allowed to under the current status. They've not been required to put deed restrictions or anything on. So they want to get it to a certain point and then put deed restrictions on after they think they can show and prove to us that the plume will not expand further. And then they would continue to monitor. The other thing I wanted to mention is that they didn't specifically address the west. Sorry, Mitch, if you could go back one more time. Okay, but I wanted the figure, yeah. This again is the what's left of the western system, and they have done quite a bit of investigation around here. It's not high concentration, but it's still above 85. It's about 100. The one well that's over 85 is about 100 parts per billion, but it's not really going down. And currently, they're doing monthly batch purging, and that's a pretty limited type of active remediation, but it is active remediation. And they haven't proposed. Their proposal does not say that they're going to continue to do that. So either they need to continue to do that and continue the active remediation, or they need to get deed restrictions in order to restrict those areas. So we'll definitely be including that in our response.
So did you speak to the fact that dock hasn't moved even though the groundwater?
Well, no, I guess I'm not going to get into that level of detail, but as I said, it's been there for a long time. You know, it has gradually it's gone down, but it's been kind of stuck for several years at where it is. And we don't, you know, I have to admit that we don't fully understand, you know, what the source of this is and where it's coming from.
And I'll add on to that, Roger, and everyone else. I mean, that is one of the more perplexing, one of the many perplexing aspects of this site. We've got an extraction well that has concentrations that exceed the cleanup criterion, but a well about 10 feet away with a shorter screen has lower concentrations. So that doesn't make sense. But another thing I wanted to touch on in response to Roger's question, and we'll get into later in our analysis of the plan, and you call that some of the criteria that we have to consider include the uncertainty. We know, for example, that obviously there was a pathway that got this stuff there once upon a time, and so we'll talk more about that, I guess, when we get into the evaluation of the proposal.
Okay, if you want to switch on to the eastern area slides. Okay, so the eastern area would be east of Wagner Road, and it's calling for an expansion of the prohibition zone, and we'll get the figure up here in just a moment, and preventing migration of 2,800 parts per billion in the Unity plume east of Maple Road for the expanded prohibition zone. And they're proposing to reduce the purging from the Evergreen wells, which are LB1 and 3, to 150 gallons per minute. Those are currently, along with AE3, which is, I'll have a figure that shows those locations in a moment. Okay, so the LB wells are in this area, and this is where the AE well is, and they're only pumping about 15 gallons per minute there. And they want to, so here's Maple Road, so the 2,800 parts per billion that threshold would have to be met at Maple Road. Well, in fact, as I mentioned, I mean, there's right now 1,000 or somewhat over 1,000 right here, so I'm not necessarily expecting that 2,800 is going to get to Maple Road, but again, that's the threshold they're proposing. Just to basically carry this line all the way up to the edge of this newly proposed. And this triangle right here, we don't think that's appropriate if this were to be approved. We certainly think this should be included because we have actually one of the highest concentration wells in the Evergreen system is in this little area, and this is another anomaly that we don't totally understand. I'm afraid. This is M14, and this one is Miller, and this is Dexter. Okay, let's see. Okay, I think maybe the next slide. Okay, so they're proposing a new pipeline from Maple Road, and I think I forgot to mention currently. They're pumping 50 gallons per minute from TW19. There's going to be another slide after that one in just a moment. They want to, because they're having trouble with the reinjection at that location on Maple Road, they are extracting 50 gallons per minute, treating it at a mobile treatment system. It's not mobile, but it's it's a smaller treatment unit. And then it's being piped back to the Maple Village Shopping Center and being reinjected into 2 separate reinjection wells. And as typically happens with those kind of wells, they're getting fouled up with mineral material and biofouling and that kind of thing. They have to shut them down periodically and rehabilitate them. And they were originally planning to pump, I think, at 200 gallons per minute there. Then it was down to 100. Now they're managing to handle 50 gallons per minute. Well, in fact, they had said that 2,800 is never going to get there, but we're going to pump this well because we want to decrease the mass. Okay, they're also proposing a potential new purge well near Rosen Valley. Again, as I mentioned before, they would do the additional well identification survey for the proposed expansion, and they would continue to do monitoring to detect any migration of the plume outside of the expanded PZ. And I think, Mitch, if you could go to the next slide. I have a figure. This figure shows the existing pipelines approximately. So here's TW19, the extraction well. They pipe it over here to their miniature treatment system. Then they pipe it back to 2 separate injection wells, and they re-inject it into the plume. And as I said, because they're having trouble with that, what they want to do, and then here is the AE3 well, and there's this existing pipeline, which then takes currently untreated water back through their deep pipeline under I-94 and back to their facility for treatment. So what they would like to do is add a portion of this pipeline here to take this water untreated and send it back to their treatment system for treatment. And then, Mitch, if you can show the next slide, I just put a graph up here. This is TW19 extraction. This is the concentration of dioxane in 200 part per billion increments. So it started out in March of 2006, about 1,000 parts per billion, and it's been pumping pretty routinely, mostly at 50 gallons per minute. And, you know, right now it's about 900 parts per billion. So that's the water that they would be proposing to pump through that additional section of pipeline and into back to their plant. And the other thing I should mention is that back in 2005, they used to have, maybe you should go back to that other figure, Mitch. This here is one of the horizontal wells that is no longer functioning, actually. That's right? All right. Yeah, I think so. So they had two pipelines in the ground. One was actually not a pipeline, it was a horizontal well. It had two long well screens, and they were extracting some high concentrations from the aquifer down 100 or 120 feet deep. And then they had a separate pipeline, which I think was a 6-inch pipeline, I'm not quite sure. That pipeline failed in 2005. They attempted to repair it. They were not able to repair it. So what they ended up doing was lining the horizontal well pipeline with a solid PVC pipe that was 4 inches in diameter. The capacity of that, in order to be able to still take the Evergreen water, contaminated groundwater, back to the plant for treatment, because there really are very limited discharge options up here for treated or untreated groundwater of any kind. So because of that, the 4-inch pipeline that is currently there, they're only able to pump 200 gallons per minute. That's the capacity of the pipeline. So that's the most they can pump back. So what they're proposing then is to stop using AE3, reduce this flow to 150, add this 50 in here, and send it all back to the facility. So again, the well doing the well identification survey for the expanded prohibition zone, and then continued monitoring to detect any migration of the plume outside of the expanded prohibition zone. And I think that's basically a summary. And I think Mitch is going to take the next section.
All right, so part of the process, Sybil's going to talk more about the process in depth, but when the department receives a remedial action plan, typically what we do is we review it. There's 8 district offices in the state. Jackson District covers 5 counties: Washtenaw, Jackson, Hillsdale, Lenawee, and Monroe counties. When we get a wrap in, we review it, see if there's enough information in it for us to make a decision. And we handled this proposal similarly. So we did our district review. We have a peer review in the district of things that come in like this, and did that yesterday and have some initial feedback using the criteria that I outlined earlier about the proposal. And there's going to be other steps in the process. Where's the pointer here? No, I got it. So how does this proposal do relative to the criteria in the opinion of the Jackson District Office? Does it assure the protection of the public health, safety, welfare, and the environment? Our conclusion is no, the proposal as written doesn't do that. Or it's uncertain. And as I said, sometimes if we determine that there's insufficient information for the department to make a decision, we will send a plan back to the person that submits the plan or have a meeting with them and tell them what additional information we need. However, given the history at this site, including the court's involvement and some of the rulings the court has made, I don't think it's in our best interest to simply do that here. So we've undertaken this review and identified at the district level how we think the proposal stacks up to the criteria in the law and the rules, and then we'll talk about it in Lansing and make a decision on behalf of the department. So do we think the proposal assures protection of public health, safety, and welfare in the environment? Either no in some cases or uncertain in other cases. And why is that? In part because the extent of the 85 parts per billion concentration is uncertain, and that applies to both the portion of the proposal that deals with the Evergreen prohibition zone expansion as well as the the area west of Wagner Road expansion. We think it's critical, especially with the stated objective on west of Wagner Road, that there won't be any expansion of the 85 ISO concentration. I think it's important that you know what the current extent is in order to come up with a robust enough plan to determine whether you've met the objective. We also aren't sure how we could be assured if there's no expansion of the 85 if you turn off purge wells as currently proposed with a hazardous substance that has the nature of the 1,4-dioxane. It's totally soluble in water, moves with the speed of groundwater, and so if you leave a large source in there somewhere just less than 500 parts per billion, that likely would serve as an ongoing source. There's uncertainty about, as Sybil mentioned earlier in our comments on the Evergreen water level study that Paul did, there's uncertainty about the potential for northeast flow from Evergreen toward Barton Pond. And I know that a lot of, I would imagine most people are concerned about Barton Pond from the standpoint that it serves as a water supply for about 80% of Ann Arbor's water, and of course that goes to Scioto Township as well. So uncertainty, and the proposal had an inadequate monitoring plan and no contingency plan. So for all those reasons, we don't think it's protective of public health, safety, welfare, and the environment, or we're not certain about it. Next slide, please. Does it comply with ARARs, those applicable or relevant and appropriate requirements? The only applicable requirement we identified was Part 201, and in our assessment, it's not compliant with Part 201. With respect to that waiver I mentioned earlier, the two rules, one, that at the commencement of a remedial action, a plume shall not expand, and the other one that active remediation is required. In our assessment, well, the proposal doesn't ask for a waiver, but we think one would be required for the Evergreen proposal as written, and with the stated objective west of Wagner Road that there wouldn't be any expansion of the 85 ISO concentration line, it wouldn't be required in that case. Next, please. Okay, there's a requirement, if you'll recall, for permanent and significant reduction of the mobility, toxicity, and volume of the hazardous substance. And again, that's a preference, but with respect to the volume, the proposal does include additional mass removal, so it does call for a reduction of the volume of the hazardous substance. Mobility, I already touched upon this, but when the purging stops, given our assessment, if you leave higher concentrations than 85 in place, the dioxane is going to continue to be mobile in the groundwater unless all concentrations are less than 85 parts per billion. And then with respect to the toxicity, we view that as relevant in the area in areas that where the use of the groundwater isn't reliably restricted. How does the proposal do with respect to the effectiveness in protecting public health, safety, welfare, and environment, and long-term uncertainty? It might not surprise you to hear that we think there's a high degree of uncertainty with the proposal. We think, at a minimum, better monitoring in the Evergreen area would be needed to confirm the hypothesis that there's flow predominantly to the east and no northeasterly component bringing contaminants toward Barton Pond. Recall that source control is one thing that we have to analyze in our proposal, and we think they may not be adequate. It wasn't really addressed in the proposal. It's unclear to us, again, how one could demonstrate that reduction of purging west of Wagner would result in no further expansion, ultimately, of the 85 concentrations. How does the proposal do with respect to the persistence, toxicity, mobility, and propensity to bioaccumulate? We know, at least from our 20-plus years with this site, that dioxane is highly persistent and mobile in the groundwater. Toxicity is a suspected carcinogen, and I'm going to take this opportunity to point out that Sybil and I just learned yesterday that what's the best way to put this? The cleanup criterion that we've got in Michigan of 85 parts per billion is based on toxicological information on hazardous substances, and Michigan uses information from the EPA and the IRIS database, and Dr. Cruz is over there, and she can tell you what that stands for. It's Integrated Risk something or other, but it's a database that EPA uses that documents or assesses the toxicological properties of individual hazardous substances, and Michigan uses that as a basis for calculating the cleanup criteria for the individual hazardous substances. Well, we just learned that EPA, I think it was on May 7th, announced in the Federal Register a new assessment of 1,4-dioxane, and that may have ramifications for the cleanup criterion in Michigan. We asked our toxicologists upon learning about this what the effect would be, and I need to caveat this with the fact that this is a federal rulemaking process that will likely take a number of years, and we don't know if the information as currently proposed in the Federal Register is going to result in the same information at the end of the pipe or at the end of the process, combined with the fact that Michigan's cleanup criterion and the toxicological parameters that generate those criterion are actually promulgated in the rules, make it such that in order for us to change our cleanup criteria, we have to repromulgate rules. So that said, the initial assessment of our toxicologist is that this proposed toxicological review of the 1,4-dioxane would result in a lower cleanup standard than the current 85. Now, if we get years down the road and it turns out Michigan's standard does get lowered as a result of repromulgating rules, the effect on this legally enforceable agreement, I'm not sure how that'll be reviewed, because recall that I cited Section 2A of Part 201 earlier that talks about if a person a person undertaking a response activity requests the department to use contemporary cleanup, i.e. a land use-based cleanup, and uses the institutional controls here, then the department shall approve it. It's not written, in my assessment, in a way that lets us, if a more restrictive requirement gets imposed, lets us impose that upon somebody. They'd have to petition us or just go ahead and purge to a lower standard. However, I think that that adds an additional degree of uncertainty to the proposal that Paul has on the table here, and that we can and should factor that into our decision making on how much mass to leave in the groundwater and whether to stop purging in certain areas. And bioaccumulative propensity is another criteria. And dioxane doesn't tend to bioaccumulate as other compounds do. How did the proposal do with respect to short-term and long-term potential for adverse health effects from human exposure? Again, in the prohibition zone, we've got, per the law and the court's order, a use restriction. So, in theory, as long as monitoring is sufficient, there shouldn't be a problem from the exposure standpoint in the area where there is a prohibition zone currently, or in the area where there's a proposed expansion. However, again, in our assessment, the monitoring plan is included in the proposal is not adequate to do what we think it needs to do. Next. Costs. As I mentioned earlier, costs are to be considered only among equally protective alternatives, and in our assessment, there's really not enough information for us to make any assessment about this because we don't think the proposal is sufficiently protective. Next, please. How about reliability? Again, I mentioned we're unsure about the migration pathways, both in Evergreen and west of Wagner, and again, I mentioned that there's a lack of a contingency plan, which in our assessment is closely tied to a monitoring plan. I think you need to have a robust monitoring plan and a contingency plan to address what would happen in the event something unexpected happens, which we've got a lot of history at this site. We've seen the unexpected. So the lack of a contingency plan impacts our assessment of the reliability of the proposal. Next. What about the potential for future remedial action costs if the alternative fails? If the current Evergreen pumping is curtailed or stopped and the plume does end up flowing toward Barton Pond and further remedial action becomes warranted as a result of that, I think it would likely increase the costs. And again, there's a potential for further expansion if they stop the purging west of Wagner at concentrations greater than 85. That does increase the likelihood for expansion and thereby the cost. But what about the potential threat to human health, safety, welfare, and the environment associated with excavation, transportation, redisposal, containment? That's not proposed, so we don't see any. We think it's adequate. Next. How about the ability to monitor remedial performance? I've already touched upon this several times. The proposed monitoring plan is inadequate. We've got an extremely complex hydrogeology here. And the nature of the 1,4-dioxane make it just imperative, that combined with the number of surprises we've seen at the site historically, make it imperative to have a robust monitoring plan associated with the remedial actions out here. And again, it's unclear to us how somebody can demonstrate leaving concentrations, in theory under their proposal, 490 parts per billion, how that, with the contaminant being so mobile, how that could not result in further expansion. So it makes it all the more critical to have a robust monitoring plan. Next. In the public perspective, we're interested to hear what people have to say both tonight and during the public comment period that Sybil's going to remind us the duration of it, and I think it ends June 8th, but she'll touch upon that. And I suspect that's going to be my last slide. With that, we'll turn it back over to Sybil.
You had another one? Yeah. Oh, jeez. Okay. You're going to have to bend down.
Given those criteria and our assessment against them, at the district level, we've identified that due to the number of deficiencies in their proposal relative to the law and the rules, including the fact that there's insufficient monitoring plan, lack of a contingency plan, uncertainty about migration pathways, and about the current location of the 85 concentrations, the proposed plan lacks sufficient detail to be either conditionally approved or unconditionally approved, which leaves us no alternative other than to recommend denial. And then we'll talk more about that process later. Vince? Well, this is a preliminary.
Go ahead.
I'm going to steal Sybil's thunder here a little bit about the process. As I said, typically we're handling this the same way we handle any other remedial action plan that comes in. After the district makes its recommendation, especially for a plan that talks about a restricted remedy, we take it up to Lansing to an internal peer review team with our management and other district supervisors, et cetera. That is scheduled for June 3rd. We're going to take it there. They'll have our recommendations. We're going to do sort of a presentation similar to how we're doing tonight, and include our geologists in that, and talk about it, see whether we get consensus from Lansing about the deficiencies and the recommendations, and the final decision will be made by our division chief, who currently we have an acting division chief, Linnell Morolf, who couldn't be here tonight because she's scheduled to travel. She's on a plane as we speak right now. So otherwise, I think she would have been here. Yes.
Okay, so as Mitch mentioned, and there's a slide reviewing this, we go to the Lansing Quality Review Team on June 3rd, so next Wednesday. We'll be presenting our recommendation to them and getting their feedback. And then, okay, June 8th is the end of the public comment period. That's a week from this coming Monday, I believe. And June 12th is when we have scheduled to provide a response to the public comment. June 15th is the date in the court schedule by which we are to respond to the proposal, June 15th. And then July 8th is also part of the schedule with the court, during which the DEQ and PLS file motions with the court, either to seek court approval of the proposal or some proposed agreed upon changes, or to resolve any disputes that we're not able to resolve. And as Mitch pointed out, we definitely have some things to resolve. And that's about as far as our schedule goes. I guess I'm hoping I'm going to get some vacation in August, but with that, I think we're going to open it up to questions and comments, and maybe we'll take some clarifying questions first, but maybe Mitch wants to say something.
Can we have a show of hands how many people are prepared to make a public comment? Okay, good. Because what I'd like to do, if everybody's amenable, is to do questions and answers before we go into the public comment, because when people come up to do the public comment, we would ask people to come up and speak into the microphone because we're recording it. And can I get consensus to do that? Okay, so we'll open it up for questions. Let's see, it's about 8:20 now. Let's try and allow maybe an hour for public comment. That gives us 40 minutes for Q&A.
Unless somebody wants to make their comments.
Is there anybody that needs to make a comment before they leave right now? Rita? Oh, okay. Okay, let's...
We want people to come up to the mic, though, because I think Roger's trying to record this.
Okay, if you don't mind, please come up to the microphone to ask some questions.
But I'm not going to start recording until we're officially taking comments.
First, I want to thank you for doing all this, and especially given your schedule. So I think it would help if you would answer just a couple of quick questions about the plumes. So what's the highest concentrations that we know of? I mean, you mentioned some concentrations, but what are the highest concentrations of 1,4-dioxane that we know of, and where are they? And this includes all media. I know that your office is groundwater, but let's also not forget soil and all that. So the highest concentrations, and then if you could just briefly describe how those boundaries of the plumes are determined. I think that we see them on a map, and we tend to think that there's a real line there. And also, will your PowerPoint be on the DEQ website?
You want to do concentration?
Yeah, I think I can. Okay. Let's see. And I should know this by heart, but I'm going to... I think TW20 that's an okay, well, the extraction wells, I guess they're not as high as they used to be. The highest one is, that's not the highest concentration. That's still on site. I think Mitch, maybe if you could find one of the plume maps, point out probably the highest one we know of now is MW5D, which I don't have last year's. This year, 5D is somewhere in this area, and that's a fairly shallow well. I guess if we wanted to get up my database, I could put that up, but in October, that well was 18,000. In August, prior to that, it was 29,000. Last year, I believe there was one hit of 64,000. That, again, is a relatively shallow well. I think it might be 15 to 20 feet. It's actually shallower than the core plume aquifer that we've been talking about. So it had gone down. Actually, I think there was a period of time when it wasn't being sampled. Let's see. Also in the core, another fairly shallow well, which is MW22, is 4,296, and that's roughly in the same area. I'm afraid I don't have a good map to show you. Okay, those are about the highest in the core area. Again, MW20 or TW20, which is an extraction well, is currently at about 2,500. That one had been quite high before when they first started purging it. But as is typically when you start extracting, you're going to get high concentrations initially, and then the concentrations tend to fall off quite a bit.
You know it's 72 is right.
Yeah, I'll get to that. I would say, by and large, there's a lot of the wells that are in the several hundreds in the Evergreen plume. There's MW17, which is somewhere in this area. That one used to be non-detect, and it's several years ago it started going up, and it's about 800 parts per billion.
Sybil, I think the main point I wanted to make was that there are parts of this contamination that are sky high. We start talking about the 85 parts per billion and the 2,800 parts per billion, and we forget that there are parts of this contamination that are 65,000 parts per billion.
I don't believe there's anything that as I said, the 5D, the MW5D, a year ago was about 64,000.
And then the other thing I wanted was about the soils.
Right, and I'm going to get to that too, although I'm afraid I don't have that data with me, and I'll mention a little bit about that. Okay. Well, one of the shallow residential wells, which is not being used anymore, at 373 Pinewood, in October of last year was 921. That had been in the 1,000 range more recently, but prior to that had been over about 3,000. And then the other high well in the, 373 Pinewood is right about in here. And then DuPont Circle, there's a residential well that's no longer in use. That's the one that's we haven't quite figured out. That has been going up very significantly. It was 952 in February of 2008. It went up to 986 in April, 1,074 in August. Then it shot up to 1,392 in October, which was quite a steep rise. And it went down again to 1,173. And then in the Unit E aquifer, 72D is at pretty much all year. We've had 4 samples in 2008 and 1 in January or February of 2009, was ranging from 3,000 to 31 1,100. And then in the Maple Village Shopping Center, okay, and did I show you where that one was? Sorry. That is right in here at the Michigan Inn. Yeah, I think that's right about in there. And then MW 85 is probably one of the higher ones. That's in the Maple Village Shopping Center, right about in there. And that's at 1478, then it was 1771 in January. They're measuring that one every month. And that's ranged from 1,100 to 1,700. It's fluctuating a little bit because it's kind of close to one of the purge wells, and they're not purging quite as much as they were. Okay, sorry. I just wanted to do one more on the other side of Maple Road. MW 115 is at 960. When it was first put in, I think it was 12 or 1,300. It's gone down a little bit, I think, but it's been in the 1,000 range. Okay, so that's the Unity, that's the deeper stuff. The soils, as I said, there was a burn pit area which is right near where their big water tower is, where they used to dispose of old filters and apparently would dispose of some liquid materials, concentrated materials. They did soil removal in that area. They've done 1 or 2 rounds of soil removal, not recently, and I don't remember those figures off the top of my head. Maybe Mitch, do you have your criteria tables? Yeah. If you could look up the direct contact number for soils, as I think I mentioned earlier, there was, and these are fairly high numbers, and I think the nature of the soils in that area is probably kind of heavier clay, and so it's not leaching out of those soils as easily, and it was obviously highly contaminated at one point. I believe there was only a few samples back in 1998, I believe was the last sampling they did, that was above the direct contact criteria, and that would be the criteria that we would look at, that, utility work, about 530,000 parts per billion. So I think there was, and Roger might know this better than I do.
More like a million.
Pardon me? Okay. But again, this is a relatively small area, and the approach that we've been taking is that because it leaches so easily through the soil, again, although that in this particular area it hasn't leached that much, and they have purge wells near that area, the concept is as long as they're purging the groundwater, eventually that contamination is going to leach through. And then if they get to the point where they're saying, okay, we've purged enough, the groundwater's cleaned up enough, whether it's under the current proposal or some new one, we would then make them go back and sample that soil to make sure that it's protective. And the soil number for dioxane that's protective of groundwater is 1,700 parts per billion, I believe. So that would be the standard that would have to be met. And how the lines get on the map, well, you could try that if you want.
I think Rita's point is the lines are approximations based on the installation of monitoring wells, and depending on the spacing of the wells, and I don't think we've got a map with us. It's got the monitor wells placed on it, but these are not cast in stone, or they're not solid. They're approximations, I think, is probably the point you were trying to make, and I think we acknowledge that they are approximations, and that points to the need for a more robust monitoring system. And we've been trying for years identifying areas that need additional characterization. This little blip here over in Evergreen is in the vicinity of the DuPont Circle, and the conceptual model that the company's put forward hasn't carried enough, hasn't convinced us that that we know what the source of that stuff is. So, does that answer your question? Next. Oh, the PowerPoint, yeah, we'll put it on our website. Go ahead.
I just have a question. Mine's more statutorily based. Regarding institutional controls and restrictive covenants and this proposed prohibition zone expansion. I live over on Center Street, so I'm going to be right in that new expansion area. My understanding of the way that works is that Paul can't just, draw that line without getting the City of Ann Arbor to create a groundwater use restriction zone, or Paul has to go to each of the individual property owners and get get us all to sign off on that. Could you just comment on how that's all going to work, what that process is?
Yeah, I could. That's a good observation, and I think you're right. Normally, that's what would be required of a person proposing an institutional control, is that they either have to work with the local unit of government to impose some kind of ordinance. In some cases, the company or entity can work with property owners, and usually it's done with somewhere in the vicinity of less than 20 property owners that need to have use restriction. The situation here is different because the court is the one that originally ordered the prohibition zone in 2004 in the Unit E decision that the court issued. So I think the short answer to your question is, if Paul is able to convince the court that their proposal to expand the prohibition zone is something that should be done, and at this point, I think it's safe to say if the district's recommendations carry the day with the department, that would be over our objections, and we would work within the court context to try and convince them why we think it's not appropriate to do at this time, given the uncertainty and all the other reasons.
The prohibition zone order allows.
Good point.
I'm totally against it because I think it's a good idea to restrict that, for pond, area.
Right, and civil.
Protect that area, but there's also the issue of property values and things like that, which are already affected. But the bigger that thing gets, more and more people are going to be affected, and it's
right, and that's
people complaining that property values all over Ann Arbor are getting affected. I just want to get some clarification on that. So thank you.
Okay, and another important point that Sybil brought up is the part of the court's order does allow for potential expansion of the prohibition zone with the agreement of the parties and the court's blessing. So, I think if I have a say in it right now, based on our review of it, I don't think it's advisable given what we know. I think before I'd be convinced it's something that...
It's pretty clear that more investigation, more definition really needs to be done. It's fairly clear to me that the whole remediation scenario is fairly inadequate right now. The fact that they're not pumping what they should be pumping, the restriction of the pipeline. I mean, there's significant problems. It sounds like with the whole system to allow us to shut this one off, and we're going to pump this, and we're going to move this. It just doesn't sound like they have a good handle on it.
Yeah, I agree that there are significant problems and some stuff we haven't touched upon tonight that is bound to be a complicating factor. One of the long-term problems associated with this site has been what to do with the water that gets pumped and treated. You may or may not be aware of the fact that they're currently they're permitted to discharge up to 1,300 gallons per minute of treated water under a permit from our department. Each one of those permits have been contested by various entities in this area for reasons that are clear to the parties that have contested it. It's just one more complicating factor, and when we talk about a contingency plan, for example, if that contingency plan were to include additional pumping and treating, somebody's going to have to propose what to do with that additional water. And for example, in the Unit E decision that got made in 2004, there was a lack of consensus, I think it's safe for me to say, within the community about whether to even put in the wells and pipelines necessary to move the water, treat it, and properly dispose of it. Now, and I'll just take this opportunity to add on, another uncertainty here is there have been numerous examples. Back in the 2004 Unit E decision making, Paul, with respect to the Maple Road area, made it pretty clear in their representations that reinjection was going to work. And they've had a lot of problems with reinjection. And so I think one of the things the department's going to do if we end up in a dispute is make it clear the number of instances where things have been said with a lot of certainty that have turned out not to be so certain, because I think it goes to a track record here that needs to be pointed out.
Do you need me to say anything for the record or anything?
Only if you want to make a public comment later. Another question.
You had said that you didn't like the proposal as presented. You would recommend denying it. What kind of changes would need to be made before you would accept it? How close is it to what you would accept?
You want me to go through each one of the criteria?
Well, one of the things that I'm really disturbed by, I haven't looked at this for a number of years, but back when I was following it was 85 ppb. Where's this 2,800 ppb coming in? I don't see this going into surface water directly.
Well, that was
all of a sudden the cleanup standard got, huge, and the practical. And it's going to end up in Barton Pond, and since that's an unreliable source, we don't have the aquifers. Then we can pump, replacement sources.
Well, with respect to what I would think they'd need in order to meet the requirements of Section 18 and 20A and the rules as it relates to the Evergreen area, I think it includes what we've already asked them to do, which is install a second well to better evaluate the groundwater flow direction in the area. And if the two additional clusters, if they install that second cluster we've asked them to do, and a cluster is two or more wells at one point on the map or one point on the land. If they were to install those and it verifies their projected groundwater flow direction, we would then require or insist or try and convince the court, whatever we need to do, on the need for a robust monitoring system to monitor groundwater flow direction and concentrations in the area of Evergreen. Probably have some sentinel wells on the inside of the. Again, this area right here is the northern boundary of the current prohibition zone. This area is what Paul has proposed. So we would probably want to see a number of wells located south of this newly proposed boundary to be monitored at a frequency that we agree upon, and for both chemical concentrations and for water levels, to determine, to document that the flow direction is to the east. I don't think we would agree to an expansion of the prohibition zone if the additional monitoring that we've asked them to do shows that there is a tendency for it to go to the northeast. Unless, there's a possibility we could do that if there was a robust contingency plan that we deem implementable. In reference to your question about where the 2,800 came from, Sybil mentioned earlier, it's the groundwater surface water interface criteria. In other words, concentrations of groundwater protected with surface water. And you're right, right now we don't have reason to believe that this part of the plume is down by the Huron River. Where that came from is Pall Life Sciences in 2004 when we were evaluating the Unit E contamination, convinced the court that the court could impose an institutional control, and since they didn't at the time project concentrations exceeding the groundwater surface water interface criteria would ever make it to the river, and they presumed that the groundwater flow direction and any contaminant plume would make it to the river, that was an appropriate standard. That wasn't the department's preferred alternative, but for various reasons the court decided otherwise. Now, with respect to west of Wagner Road, what would we require to get them to or to allow the proposal? I think we would need better characterization to satisfy ourselves that we know where the 85, the extent of the concentration is 85 and greater, and use those wells in conjunction with possibly others to monitor a performance standard that we would insist be met that says, as proposed, that the plume won't expand beyond 85. And I think we'd have to have a lot of discussions both with Paul and with ourselves and with our card stakeholders about how, if at all, it's possible to stop or reduce purging where concentrations exceed, are less than 500, but somewhere around 490. How that would result in no further expansion. So I think that's. Well, again, I didn't say I like or dislike their proposal, and I'm not saying I'm okay or not okay with any expansion of the prohibition zone. Our job is to do what the law says, and the law says if somebody that's implementing response actions proposes something that's consistent with the law, then we have to approve it. So what we've done is we've identified deficiencies in what they've proposed, and if it turns out there's no northeasterly flow and they come up with a mutually agreed upon monitoring system to ensure that contaminated groundwater doesn't go toward Barton Pond and ultimately into it, I think we'd have to approve it. So that's. You're absolutely positive that pollution will never get to Barton Pond? The question is, am I absolutely positive the contamination won't get to Barton Pond? And the answer is no, I am not, and that's our main concern. And that's why we think a robust monitoring network is required, and better determination of the groundwater flow direction.
Thanks for having the comment period, even though the court tried to limit it. Appreciate your efforts. I wanted to note that Councilmember Mike Anglin did come in a few minutes after you announced members, official members. I was at a CARB meeting where we talked about whether this proposal actually shows that Paul is in violation of the consent agreement. And my question is, why are they not found in contempt of that consent agreement? Is the DEQ prepared to propose the judge find them in contempt? I think the DEQ's comments were that they felt that they were in violation given the data that they presented and the maps that they presented in this proposal.
I think the information we have does show that they've lost capture in Evergreen, which would be a violation of the consent judgment. And I don't know where we're going to go with that. I mean,
so you haven't made a decision whether to recommend that or not?
Recommend
the judge, that they be in contempt?
I think, yeah, we haven't made that decision yet, but if and when we do go to court, I think it behooves us to point that out. And I think the main reason I'm hesitant, well, there's two reasons. One is because some of it, you know, we haven't discussed it with our attorneys and such, and then two, given the court's rulings to date, as you're well aware, you know, Sybil mentioned we went to court in 2004 to enforce consent judgment and assess stipulated penalties, which to this day the court is still holding under advisement. The court is well aware because they awarded the, or excuse me, they ordered the 5-year plan that, based on what Paul represented, their ability to get the cleanup in Evergreen within 5 years. The court is well aware that that deadline has come and gone. And
well, I think the CARD group voted that the DEQ should recommend that they be held in contempt, and it's was discussed that this is a marker that we could put in the sand, so to speak, and instead of rewarding them for doing a very poor job, we should be citing them for being in violation of that agreement that they made of their own free will and signed paperwork indicating that they would meet that standard and have not by their own data and their own maps. So.
Okay, we'll definitely consider that.
Hi, did you look at the 2575 Valley Drive right here? Did you look at the data I sent you on that?
I'm aware of it.
Because that's, in all indications, looks like it's the same elevation as everything at Evergreen, the shallower parts of Evergreen. So that would be evidence right there that they lost the plume. They're telling that again, I can't bring up my Google Earth displays that shows all the nice charts and graphs and everything because we don't have Wi-Fi here. But the chart there shows that it's about to go over 85 parts per billion. They're calling that well an undetermined aquifer. They don't say it's part of the E, they just say it's undetermined. And of course, if this proposal was passed, they wouldn't have to sample that. They're saying this would be one of the wells that wouldn't be sampled just before it's about to go over the cleanup criteria. So it's like they want to hide this particular troublesome data point. Just like they hid MW30D data point from 1993 to 2001. And that was MW30D, remember, was the only one they said was in the E aquifer in this whole quadrant over here. And had that been sampled all along, maybe we would have discovered this E plume years earlier, maybe 7 years earlier, and not had the municipal water supply contaminated. We don't want the same thing to happen here, that this is actually another offshoot. If it's not coming from here, where is it coming from? If it's not coming from here, is it heading north? They can't get away with not sampling troublesome data points. It's time to stop that. Make sure they're rigorous about their sampling, and you guys need to be rigorous, and of course you don't have the staff because of budget cuts and things, but we citizens can help you point out where troublesome problems are, and we actually have tools now that are superior to what tools you're using, because we actually can show the wells on the map, turn them on and off. We can show 16,000 data points, and you can let the audience see for themselves where the high readings are and which way they're going. So, you know, we can provide you data that's their data, and you can use that data and make sure it gets into the court, because I don't think any of this, a lot of our recommendations have not made it to the court. I don't know if it's because there's somebody in the DEQ that's blocking this, or if it gets over to the AG's office, somebody there is blocking it before it gets down to the representative who has to be in court. But the fact that the assistant AG hasn't been in any of the card meetings or the DEQ meetings for the last year or so, I think she was at one maybe. I think that's troublesome that, we're not sure who's making the decisions on this at the state level. Maybe some of the state people here can do some inquiry and find out who's actually making the decision on this.
Just a couple of questions. I note that there's the the city's northwest supply well just outside of the boundary. Is that well tested as part of this whole process for 1,4-dioxane? I mean, I actually have three questions. Okay. Do you want me to give them all at once? That's one question. Is that tested? The other question is how fast is the plume moving? And I'm talking about the pink plume, the Unit E plume. And last question is, I know that there's a notation that Michigan is one of the the most lax of levels for 1,4-dioxane. Can you comment on what is sort of the prevailing wisdom of other states on the cleanup level?
This actually one of the ways that we discovered that the Unit E aquifer was contaminated was when the city tested the Northwest Water Supply well and found 1 or 2 parts per billion of dioxane in it, and they have not used that well since then. They previously used it only in the wintertime to warm up the river water, and that sampling is continued. The city is sampling that. I'm not sure if it's still quarterly. It's at 2 or 3 parts, maybe 4 parts per billion. When the prohibition zone was first drawn, I mean, when the court basically determined that there would be a prohibition zone, the DEQ included the Northwest Supply well, and the judge took it out and basically left the issue to be resolved between Pall Life Sciences and the city of Ann Arbor, and they had their own lawsuit. And I'm not going to get into that, but that's the deeper Unit E aquifer. Yeah, that's. Pardon me? Mm-hmm. How fast is the Unit E moving? I'm not a hydrogeologist. I think it's potentially a foot or 2 per day at the most, probably. Mitch, I don't know if anyone has really looked at that.
I think Farsad might have mentioned a foot a day, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. And in terms of the state of Michigan's lax standard, I mean, I can't address other states. As I said, back in 1992, the cleanup criteria was 3 parts per billion. Basically, there were hardly any laboratories that could measure that low. It's a pretty difficult compound to measure for. In 1995, the legislature changed the risk value for carcinogens or presumed carcinogens, which dioxane is, to from 1 in a million cases of cancer. So if you drink a certain, and I can't tell you how toxicologists come up with these numbers, but they do have, they do use methods. And so if you drank if your drinking water supply in 1992 had 3 parts per billion in it, and you drank that every day, that was your water supply for 70 years, right, then 3 parts per billion or less was okay, but anything above that was not okay. In 1995, the legislature changed the risk factor for 1 additional case of cancer for drinking that amount of water from 1 in a million to 1 in 100,000. So that would have changed the number to 30 parts per billion. But at the same time that change was implemented by the legislature, the DEQ adopted EPA protocol on how to calculate the risk, and they changed the exposure from 70 years or 75 years, which was considered your lifetime, to either 30 or 35 years, I forget, based on the assumption that most people don't live in the same place for their entire lives, and so you're unlikely to be drinking that for your entire life. That's how, I mean, I think that's about as simple as I can put it. There's a lot of calculations that go into those factors. So that in 1995, so instead of being 3 or going up to 30 based on the 1 in a million to the 1 in 100,000 change, it went to 77 parts per billion. Then there was another change that was made some years later that took it up to 85. Again, that was calculations done by toxicologists, slope factors. I'm not positive, but I thought they assumed that you went away for 2 years. Yeah, they do take into account, they try to make it realistic. But anyway, so that's how Michigan arrived at 85 parts per billion. So other states may be using the 1 in a million risk factor. They may be using the 70-year exposure scenario. So that's, I presume, is the difference. But I really can't speak to how other states have come up with their criteria. But right now, the EPA, and I'm not sure that I fully understand this new IRIS number, but if EPA promulgates a maximum contaminant level, or an MCL, such as for benzene, I believe that's 5 parts per billion. That's something that the state of Michigan law automatically adopts. But dioxane does not have an EPA-established drinking water criterion, so the drinking water criterion by default goes to our cleanup standard, which does incorporate risk to humans drinking the water. So if the EPA were to establish an MCL, then the DEQ would automatically adopt that. But I think the number that Mitch was talking about earlier is just the toxicological data that we look at in order to determine our own numbers. Is that correct, Mitch?
Well, to be clear, this IRIS toxicological information that I referenced earlier is not a number. And again, I'm not a toxicologist either, but my understanding, and I did look at it, it's hundreds of pages, and it's a whole toxicological profile where the toxicologists look at a bunch of stuff related to a hazardous substance. And if that proposed rule is adopted, that would change some parts of the algorithms or the calculations that Michigan uses, some of the factors in the equation, and it would result in a different number. And again, keep in mind that Michigan has numbers, generic criteria calculated for a bunch of different pathways. Drinking water is one of them. Another one is showering and things like direct contact with soils, or groundwater contact criteria for utility workers working in trenches where they might get exposed to groundwaters, indoor inhalation for different chemicals, and one for dioxane is unique. It's sort of shows up as a volatile chemical, but it wouldn't have a high risk of indoor inhalation in the same manner as benzene, like Sybil just mentioned. So it's not, this IRIS toxicological information that EPA has proposed is not a number per se, but it has information that goes into the equation that would result in a number, which, if it gets years down the line finalized and absent of EPA's promulgation of a maximum contaminant level or an MCL, we'd have to repromulgate our rules. But Sybil is correct. If EPA promulgates a number, then by law under Part 201, that automatically becomes our standard. Sybil points out that it's 9 o'clock. So we should wrap up questions. Any other questions before we get into public comment? two brief ones, and then we can.
Who is actually doing the monitoring of the wells, and what accounts for the variations that you stated in the levels that are reported? So it seems like really there hasn't been much improvement over time, and sometimes it goes up.
The monitoring is done by PALL Life Sciences, and we, in the past, have done some split sampling with them and taken them to our own labs. But basically, that's the way our program operates, because we don't have the resources to do it ourselves. But we do, I review the data when it comes in every month. Some wells are sampled quarterly, some wells are, a few are sampled monthly, some are sampled semi-annually or annually. And I review it. We have a geologist who also reviews it. Again, we have done some split sampling. In general, those numbers have, have matched up pretty well. There is just a natural variability to a certain extent, and I put the one graph up there, and I don't know if there was something else you were referring to. That was an extraction well, and number one, the rate that they're pumping that extraction well has varied over time. So if they're pulling in a higher volume of water, they're more likely to be pulling in more adjacent clean water, which might dilute the concentration. So, I mean, an extraction well shouldn't be used for determining what the extent of contamination is. It's, you want that well to be high because that indicates that it's pulling lots of mass out. In some cases, such as in the Evergreen system, we knew when the LB extraction wells were installed back in 92, 93, and they first started purging those were very low. But the whole concept, and this was the way the consent judgment was written, it allowed the contamination that was in the core to migrate to the Evergreen system, knowing that it was going to get higher. And, that was clearly a mistake. It should have been captured at the source. So yes, there are wells that if the contamination is migrating and not controlled, such as parts of the Unit E plume that are going into Evergreen, those wells are going to go up. But in other places where they have been remediating, there have been wells that the concentrations have gone down. So, but there are variations. It's just inherent in the process. We look at trends, but some wells go up and down for no reason. Other wells you can kind of see trends, and you can look at nearby extraction wells and determine whether those are functioning well or not by the adjacent monitoring wells. So it's complicated, and I'm afraid there's no real easy answer. But
this gentleman here had a question, and we'll get to yours real quick, and then we'll do public comment.
I was wondering if you could clarify the relationship between the DEQ and the court as far as exercising authority over what gets approved and what doesn't. My concern is much in the same way that the schedule for public comment and the schedule for reviewing proposals, much in the same way the court sort of trumped DEQ's normal schedule. And as the gentleman pointed out earlier, there's the usual way that prohibition zones are established, and the court sort of trumped that. My concern is that all of the recommendations that are made, the court might trump elements of it or all of the recommendations that are made.
right. I mean, typically the company submits a proposal to us. We review it, approve it or deny it, or say no, you've got to go back and do this or that. And a lot of times they will. Sometimes we have some back and forth. They disagree, but we may reach agreement ultimately. If there's a dispute that we can't reach agreement, there's a process in the consent judgment, the dispute resolution process, that requires us to take the evidence to court and present it to the court, and the court makes the decision. I,
I'm going to jump in here.
okay, we want to be
Short
short.
answer is the court is the ultimate decision maker by virtue. I mean, that's a choice the department has to make when we take a party to court to enforce state environmental law. Is we run the risk that the court might disagree with us. In this case, we got the consent judgment that was entered in '92, and then revisions have been taking place since then, and we don't have the control that we would otherwise have. So I think your concern is well-founded, and we have to make strategic decisions based on a number of concerns about whether a ruling that we find unpalatable is something that we can appeal by law, and whether we have the resources to make such an appeal. And I'd say anytime the court rules against us, or that's a consideration. We have a discussion and make a decision on whether to appeal, even if we have the ability to appeal. And the one quick question, then we're going to do public comments.
I think I did better talking than this. I'm going to have trouble hearing over here with the mic. But I live north of Miller, west of Wagner, and then you have some little tributary of Honey Creek that runs and crosses Miller Road west of Wagner, and then it goes north, travels north, so it's about a half a mile or less from us. And I wonder what effect this, I guess that is receiving some of the effluent that you are taking out of the ground. And I don't know how well that is being treated, but I've been drinking the water since '75, so that's like 34 years. What year did they Gelman start his stuff?
1966.
Huh?
1966 is when they started using dioxane.
Okay, so I've already in that 30, you said 30 years, right? 35, right? You remember you were saying a few minutes ago about drinking water for 35 years, but I'm already at that level now. I hope I'm drinking a little while longer,
Well, do you know how deep your well is?
There's really a big question as to, you have some land that is rather clean, and you're dumping this stuff and sending it, our way. And I guess it's going in the ground. And so it is a big concern. And I wonder also, are plans being made for us to have municipal water now at the same time that you're dealing with all of this? Have you thought about all of that too?
Well,
we're all wells, so we all have a well,
We're aware that area is not served by municipal water, and it's certainly not our intention. And there's no, to the Honey Creek issue. I mean, the Honey Creek is a shallow water body of water, and the current discharge that they've had since '97. I think it's been, I guess it's varied over time, but they have to meet right now 7 parts per billion in their effluent of dioxane that goes into the creek, and usually it's somewhat less than that. So, and they have tested down the creek. I would say years ago, when all the process was ongoing, there was probably more dioxane going down there then. But there have been wells tested in that area, and we've not detected any dioxane in them. And that's something you can do on your own as well. I don't think we're aware of any particular threat in that area. But I understand your concern, and certainly it is not our intention that the plume would expand into areas where there are people using water supply wells, and that's one of the concerns with the potential northeast flow to the Huron River.
With the prohibition zone, though, with a person with a well, Is Gelman saying that they have to hook up then to the city, no matter what, even if they're a Scioto Township resident, they're still, well, that they would, and they are in that prohibition zone?
Right. If someone is within the prohibition zone, if it gets expanded into an area where municipal water isn't available because there, well, even if it is available, but the prohibition zone is expanded to that area, then yes, you would be required to hook up to city water, and then
Whose responsibility or Gelman? Is Gelman going to pay for it?
Gelman would pay for the water supply. They would pay to connect.
They're not going to pay for all the digging and putting the pipe in and getting hooked up to the city that costs $6.
Well, they wouldn't pay for the sewer. They wouldn't pay for the sewer line, but they would have to pay for the water line.
Okay.
But we better get to public comment.
Thank you for your questions, and we want to open it up for comment. Do we need to turn this recorder on?
Yeah.
All right. I don't know that we need to impose a time limit on people's comments. We've got 45 minutes, so I'll ask people to come up, raise your hand, state your name for the record. We'll record it, and hopefully we'll be able to accommodate everybody's comments within the 45 minutes we've got. Who would like to go first? Front row, and then the gentleman in the white shirt after that.
I'm Michael Moran, Ann Arbor Township Supervisor, and I'll keep my comments brief. I thank you for your initial recommendation to deny this modification. Ann Arbor Township has about 2,000 residential parcels, about 4,500 residents. In the eastern part of the township, they are all connected to the Ann Arbor water supply system. In the northern part of the township, everybody who uses water gets it from a water well. And worse yet, in that area of the township, there is absolutely no water infrastructure to hook anyone up to in the case of a failure. In addition, Ann Arbor Township includes a substantial portion of the entire county's office space. We have the world or continental headquarters of Domino's Pizza, the National Sanitation Foundation, NSK Barron's, Conway Freight, IZ Sakin, AW Technology. All of these corporations are hooked up to the Ann Arbor water supply system, and many of them use them, like the National Sanitation Foundation, for its operations and testing. In addition, we house the East Medical Campus of the University of Michigan, which is also connected to the Ann Arbor water system. I've been following this cleanup over several years with an increasing degree of alarm and frustration. The facts tend to indicate that over a period of time, Pall Life Sciences has been reluctant to put forth its best efforts, refusing to employ the best cleanup methods and failing to adequately explore the movement of the plume. The proposal recently presented by Paul is the latest step in a cleanup that continually favors cost savings for PLS over effective cleanup and the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of this area. Now they propose to treat less water, treat to a lesser degree, and wait and see what happens. Certainly I agree with your recommendation or your initial finding that there is a grossly insufficient monitoring system to really see what would happen if this amendment were approved. And worse yet, there is absolutely no plan to address the many additional persons that would be burdened if they're wrong, and in fact, this plume does reach Barton Pond, or worse yet, goes under the river and reaches Ann Arbor Township, where again there is absolutely no way to connect to any water system and no infrastructure. In short, there's no line of canaries for monitoring and no plan to see how to provide water to the many people of Ann Arbor Township for whom there is no water system within miles. I want to just very briefly address the regulatory provisions that you were addressing earlier. I do disagree with you in one respect, and that is I believe that under Section 118 sub 4, this proposed amendment will not, quote, significantly reduce the volume of the contaminant, and that is the way that section is worded. Subsection 5A of 118 also requires that where the release is intentional, as it was here, there has to be a showing that it is, quote, technically infeasible, end quote, to meet the standard previously agreed upon in the consent decree. Certainly there's been no showing here that it is technically infeasible to meet that standard. Subsection 5D, as you did note, does say, refers to a naturally occurring process that could come into play to remediate, and here there is none, as you have found. Under Section 5I, certainly it has not been demonstrated that this proposal will have no adverse environmental effect. And under Section 11, the very terms of this proposal plan for a, quote, significant increase, which is the words used in that provision, in concentration in the absence of active removal to the extent previously consented to. One other section I want to mention, and that is Regulatory Rule 299.5705, subsection 5, which essentially says that where the horizontal and vertical extent of hazardous substance concentrations in an aquifer shall not be allowed to increase after the initiation of remedial actions to address an aquifer, which is the situation here, except as approved by the director as provided in Section 118 of the Act. And certainly I urge the director not to permit this amendment and to allow this to occur. Finally, I just want to incorporate the comments made by CARD. Were detailed on the document dated May 20th that has previously been provided to DEQ. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Stephen Bean. I live at 810 South Main in Ann Arbor. I just want to say I appreciate your analysis and I agree with your recommendation. I simply want to ask that you do whatever you can within your ability to strengthen that and clarify it as much as possible before going to the court with it. In part, in an attempt to avoid a need to go for an appeal in the future. I think to make your best case now rather than leave any openings for that possibility would be what I think all of us here would appreciate, and I certainly would. So I again agree with what you stated. You did mention something a little bit later that sounds like it could help strengthen your case. I encourage you to find all of those and get them all included and make them as clear as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
My name is Adele Laporte, and I'm the president of the Board of Trustees of Barton Hills Village. And I also thank you for everything that you've done, probably under adverse circumstances, since we know that you probably don't get the resources that you need. Barton Hills, if you're not familiar with it, we are a village, a municipality. We have a municipal water supply. And we've always thought, well, if anything happened to our municipal water supply, we could get water from the city of Ann Arbor, which we don't want to do, but we could. But the point is, if this plume gets to Barton Pond, it basically will end up contaminating our wells also. And although we do have the infrastructure, we wouldn't have any place to hook onto. And so, and looking at this new prohibition zone, it's all north. And if you sort of draw a line from where it started through sort of the middle of it, you end up in Barton Pond. And so what I'm hoping is that the focus will really be on testing toward the north, toward the path that would, in fact, lead the plume to the area of Barton Pond. Because all of the people that have hooked up under prohibition zones, to say nothing of the city of Ann Arbor and Barton Hills Village, we all depend on that water source in Barton Pond. And so that is my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes?
My name is Vince Crusoe. I live at 556 Glendale Circle in Ann Arbor. I'd like just to reiterate that I think that Paul should not be rewarded for their poor performance in their cleanup, that they should be held in contempt as their data and maps indicate. their own data and maps indicate that they are in violation of the consent agreement in which they entered. I think that's of paramount importance that we protect Ann Arbor's significant water source, which is Barton Pond. That their proposal seems to indicate that the plume is moving north by the change in the recommended prohibition zone, which is almost a 100% increase to the north compared to what we have now. I think the judge should hire a professional expert master to help him evaluate the dangers associated with groundwater contamination and drinking water sources for Ann Arbor. I think it's an important enough issue that would warrant that effort on his part. And I also think we need to consider the high soil concentrations that exist in the central zone of this contamination, and if that is recontaminating the groundwater, that should be cleaned up and not allowed to be recontaminating the groundwater for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Bob Bailey, resident of Scioto Township over the western plume. And first I have some general comments. The court should be reminded that PLS is not in compliance with their previous orders, and the judge should take this into consideration in allowing whatever degree of flexibility. I think it is logical that all of the different court orders be combined into one overall cleanup plan. However, this has clearly been drafted for the purpose of reducing the amount of future work by PLS on the remediation. One of the important things to remind the judge is that the protectiveness must not be compromised. They state that in the goal of their proposal, and the judge needs to make sure that this is not compromised. It's not surprising that the concentrations simply aren't going down to zero. They report that they've recovered 79,000 pounds of dioxane and destroyed it. However, that's only 10% of the 800,000 pounds that was reported to have been discharged. This is a project that is going to be continuing for decades. More specifically, I think that the new court order that will be coming out of this should refer to the drinking water criteria rather than the 85 parts per billion. The drinking water criterion has changed during this process previously, as you mentioned, and it's likely to change again because this is a project that will be going on for decades. In the case of the western area, rather than stopping extraction and simply denying the use of the groundwater, the remediation should be continued until it drops below the drinking water criteria, rather than allowing the continued migration, which doesn't show on your map, but towards the northwest, where there is no public water supply available. The concentrations are in the 30s, just south of I-94. North of 94, there is no Ann Arbor city water. Also, I think it's good that you have pointed out the uncertainty and that they need to make provision to positively stop the northern migration of the plume at this new prohibition zone boundary, because if it gets farther north, it's on its way to Barton Pond, and there is no public water supply during part of the area between the Evergreen and Barton Pond. In addition, it'd be real handy if you could get Paul to provide all the graphs and everything in a computer usable form rather than just as PDF files. So those of us who are watching these things can analyze the pictures as we do the Excel data tables that you distribute. Thank you.
Thank you. In the back.
I'm Karen Sidney. I live at 100 Longwood Lane in Ann Arbor. A number of years ago, when my home was becoming a brownfield, I went over to the public library and looked at the file that was there. And much to my amazement, I found many, many piles of papers with bureaucratic and lawyer talk and very, very little science. And as I listened to this presentation tonight, I don't think much has changed. This plan that is proposed by Paul is an insult to the residents of Ann Arbor and Scioto Township and the other areas that are going to be affected by this. I am appalled that the DEQ spent a year talking to Paul and never let the public involved, and I have been told that the people involved in CAR wanted to know what's happening. You're coming to us now and saying, oh dear, the judge gave us a short timeline, but you sat on that data for a year and you never let it out to the public. We could have been looking at it. I don't think that a few more monitoring wells are going to fix what's wrong with this problem. It shouldn't be allowed to expand. And I hear about, oh dear, it's out of our control. The judge is going to make a decision. We can't control it. Well, what the judge does depends a lot on the quality of the case that's presented. And I think that the case that's been presented to the judge is a piece of crap. and it's a bad legal representation and bad science behind it. When I first got involved with this, Granholm had just been elected, and I was told by some of my elected representatives, oh, just wait, it takes time to turn it around. Well, I haven't seen it turn around, and I've become a real cynic because I think that the environmental rules in Michigan are more about giving developers subsidies than it is protecting the public from environmental contamination.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Okay, I'm Rita Locke Caruso, and I live at 556 Glendale Circle in Ann Arbor. I support the Jackson office decision to recommend denial of the proposed changes to the consent judgment by PLS. I thank your office for giving a thoughtful response about the failure of the proposed changes to protect the public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. The main concern must be the threat to the water supply of Ann Arbor, which will ultimately threaten the vitality and the property values of this city. There is no contingency plan in the proposed changes for that. Among the previous comments, I agreed with the previous comments made. I was particularly grateful to Mike Moran for his thoughtful analysis. But one thing I would like to address that hasn't been addressed is what I think is the failed logic of the prohibition zone and the proposed expansion of the prohibition zone. I encourage your office to vigorously oppose any expansion of the prohibition zone. I think at its core, the concept of the prohibition zone is seriously, critically, mortally flawed. It does not prevent exposure because there is no buffer zone or gradient between the 2,800 part per billion concentration allowed in the prohibition zone and the 85 parts per billion in the groundwater that is supposedly safe for people to drink. The expansion proposed of the prohibition zone is contradictory to PLS's claim that the flow is to the east and not to the north. If the flow is not to the north, why do we need to expand the prohibition zone to allow higher concentrations there? If they're not going to be higher concentrations there because it's not flowing, then why on earth do you need to increase the prohibition zone further north? It's completely contradictory and illogical. The expansion of the prohibition zone will simply just allow PLS the contamination to expand, and this will be in violation of Rule 705A. I would encourage the focus of the cleanup to shift and emphasize the area of the highest contamination as the source of the groundwater contamination. We heard tonight that the soil has concentrations up to 900,000 parts per billion. To me, it is illogical to use groundwater as a cleanup method for contaminated soil, which is how I understood the answer to my question, that we will wait till the groundwater reaches a certain concentration that's acceptable, and then we will see if the soil is clean enough. That is totally, I think it is an extraordinary misuse of groundwater as a precious resource. The predictions are that water is going to cost more than oil in 2 to 4 decades. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Gloria Jones. I'm at 1630 North Maple on the corner of Maple and Miller Road. I would agree with many of the woman's last comments. Institutional controls should be in place to protect the water supply first and not PLS's liability. I agree with the MDEQ about a more comprehensive and better monitoring plan. Also, I think it's really important to have more of an emphasis on the flow rates of the different plumes if you guys decide that that's going to be your argument, that there's 2 or however many. We need direction and rate of flow. I would agree with Roger as well. I think you guys have one chance to bring this, and I think you're going to probably want a little bit stronger GIS and maps with some different focus points, and I think it would be really important to add as well to your purge wells if you're going to do trend charts to show that decrease or increase in amount of purged water. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt?
Thank you. I'm Matt Nod. I'm the environmental coordinator for the City of Ann Arbor. I live at 353 Lake Park Lane, right on top of the plume. Again, thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate the opportunity for public comment. I also thank the public for coming out, and if folks have questions, you can reach my email address on the city's website under environmental coordination. I'll send official comments from the city, but just some comments in addition to what was said earlier. I do think we need to demonstrate there's no flow to Barton Pond before there's any discussion of expanding the cleanup strategy, integrating. As folks have said before, there's no monitoring plan to the north, but I would also remind DEQ and the folks in the audience that the city also obtains a significant amount of drinking water from the south by the airport. And so if the prohibition zone remains, there really needs to be a strict boundary, 0 ideally, that if we're going to provide this free ride to the river, it needs to be 0 to the north and 0 to the south, and significant consequences if it's exceeded in any way. That gets me to the contingency plan, and that needs to be multifaceted. There are small exceedances that have happened here and very large ones. And what are we going to do in the really bad worst case scenarios? And those need to be demonstrated and thought about. There's a discussion of mass removal in the proposal, but there's no goals, no performance standards, nothing that says we're expanding the prohibition zone or we're changing the pumping from 1,300 gallons a minute down to 800 gallons a minute, but we're doing that to get more mass. So I would ask the DEQ to make sure that in any agreement, in any court order that comes out of this, there are clear performance measures on mass removal, and that gets at, going back to the core as Rita had said previously. So again, I'll summarize these and provide those, but thanks again.
Thank you. Senator Gray.
Good evening. I'm sorry, this is too high for me, so I'll just take it down. I want to thank you for coming and listening. I'm here to support my constituents and the local officials that are here in their comments. I know that you're operating under very adverse circumstances, and I appreciate your initial recommendations that the company's proposal not be adopted. I want to thank all of my constituents, especially the card members, and have to mention Roger Rail in particular for his many, many decades of work now that's gone into educating the public about this matter. I'm particularly concerned about the potential migration of the plume to Barton Pond and other supplies of water to the municipalities and townships that I represent, and I agree that it is totally illogical to allow an expansion of this prohibition zone. I think that the emphasis should be on aggressively removing the mass from the core and wherever else it can be captured. As you said, to work harder to characterize the plume and to monitor it. I hope that the department can act as assertively as possible under state law and rule. Having said that, I regret several mentions were made to the weakening of the law in 1995, and I want to note for the public that I voted and fought against that weakening of the law when I was in the House. I'm currently working on legislation to restore the old standards, but we don't have currently a majority in the state Senate that would support that change back to the old more protective standards. So references to lack of progress under the current administration need to be put in the perspective of working within the framework of this weakened law that occurred in 1995. And that is a source of ongoing frustration, but it's also the lack of resources for the department that the legislature has failed to provide, and I want to note that that is an ongoing concern, and that we need to provide more resources to the DEQ so that you can monitor and enforce and see compliance for our regulations. So thank you very much.
I'm Roger Rail. I live at 3141 North Wagner Road in Scioto Township. I used to work in an office right over the western plume, the old western plume. And before we moved to the house in Scioto, I used to live on Fay, which is where the Evergreen plume is heading towards. In fact, it looks like the E plume would have gotten our house now, our old house. Anyway, thank you for your initial recommendation to reject this. I think it's a shame that it's taken this long. It should have never come to this point. I'm quite upset with the secrecy that went on for months and months without any idea of what actually was going on. I want to reiterate all the card points that we covered last week in the meeting, and I don't know how to submit the Google Earth mashups that I presented last week, but I think those show clearly that past analyses of the E plume and some of the other layers show a northeast flow, and in some cases northerly flow. In fact, once you get past a certain point, it might even go northwest, and in fact could hit my house where I live now. So, it's important that you hold the line on this and be tougher on the company, because they've already missed a bunch of opportunities to stop this when they took over in 1997, let alone the liabilities they assumed when they took over for Gelman and the lack of cleanup that Gelman exhibited. So again, all these major points that we covered last week, I want to reiterate those. I have a new layer in the mashup from Rick Mandel's analysis that also shows a northeast flow if you eliminate the wells that during their pump tests that weren't influenced by the pump test. I'm a little concerned about the cherry picking of wells for that analysis that Paul Gelman did. We can't go back and add in the new wells, or other wells that maybe should have been sampled at the same time. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and with all that uncertainty, you have to reject this, and not only reject it, but maybe if they want a prohibition zone, make the prohibition zone for Evergreen where they say the plume is now. Just don't let it get any bigger. They're supposed to be cleaning it up. And like I said, with the 25-75 Valley data, it looks like they've already lost it there. MW81 is another example. And then the whole area of DuPont Circle, the 465 DuPont Circle, that's been several hundred, over 1,000 parts per billion now for several years. If that's going north, that wouldn't hit Barton Pond. It would hit the Huron River before Barton Pond. And I remind you, there's a lot of township wells in that area that don't have access to city water. So I think it's time to get serious on this and quit screwing around with these bogus proposals and get hard-nosed. I don't know how to get to the judge. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't even know who's making the decision on this. I mean, you have your decision, but it's just as likely to be overturned through the channels up and down the line before it gets to the judge. And then the judge might overturn it. So I don't know if we need to have some civil action here to forestall what might be a bad decision along the line or something, but it's time we get serious on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Ryan Seabolth. I'm here with the office of Representative Pam Burns. That's the 52nd House District. Representative Burns is sorry that she can't be here tonight, especially because she is very deeply concerned about the current situation, the effectiveness of the proposal, and the potential for migration of the plume. She understands the difficulties under which the department is working. She appreciates the updates that she's received from DEQ, including her conversation with Director Chester, and wants to be of assistance in any way appropriate.
Thank you.
Mike Anglin, 5th Ward Representative for the City of Ann Arbor. I moved here in 1992 and I lived in this neighborhood and watched some of the people go through this process of having their wells affected in the immediate area and their water being, their wells no longer useful. As time has gone on, the project and the process has increased and included more and more people. I think that should be our approach to the future, that this is probably not something that, as other speakers have said, it just go away. This is something that we have has the big elephant in the room with us. And we should be aggressive about this. And perhaps what we should do is request that monitoring wells be placed far exceeding what appears right now. So before it happens, we're learning about it. So we can maybe see a migration. And then to not agree with anything that we see as anything but helpful to the community. Many of the people here speak of water quality. It's probably our greatest resource here in Michigan, as we all know. And we certainly can't jeopardize that in any shape or form, or to have a reputation that says we had a big problem and we just kind of ignored it. And then one day it really hits us. And that's a sad thing. So I think what we should do is be more aggressive with this and to simply say that as a community, and it's basically a lot of people who live in the 5th Ward who are affected by this and who have been, I think many of them have felt ignored by the city. And I don't know what more could have been done, but now that we're at a point of potential change, that we should be very proactive about this. And I thank you for what you all are doing. I have attended some meetings, at Zeeb Road, et cetera, and I learned some about this, but it's extremely complex. But I do think that the community's mental state is being affected here. Because many people will look at it and say, well, oh my gosh, what if that did happen? Community health and welfare is fine, but what about the mental attitude that people have about what we are doing? And I'd like us to be, again, proactive here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Glenn Thompson, resident of Ann Arbor. What I really want to express is my opinion of the complete, total incompetence of the MDEQ. I do not mean to imply that this is limited to your office. I think it is pervasive throughout the organization. But this problem has been known for 20 years. And we've been following it for many, many years. And every time you come and give us a presentation, oops, the plume is a little bigger, the concentrations are a little higher, the problem is always expanding. If this problem had been aggressively treated 20 years ago, it would be effectively clean now. And that is the failure of both our elected officials and of the MDEQ. I think that the concept of constantly expanding the allowable concentrations, expanding the area that is allowed to be contaminated, is totally and completely inconsistent with the general intent of the environmental laws and of the purpose of the MDEQ, which is to protect the public health and welfare. I was particularly unhappy tonight when I heard Mitch say that why a few more monitoring wells and we would be happy. And that's what we've heard consistently for 10 or 20 years. A few more monitoring wells. We don't quite know what's happening. Yes, I agree you don't know what's happening. But a few more monitoring wells only tells you after it's happened. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Stand up so I can see it. Last call for comments. Okay, we'll close down the public comment period. We've got a few more minutes if people want to do any informal questions. So we're not available. Thanks a lot, everyone, for coming. Appreciate it.